Thank you for joining Wars of the Rosies as we continue with Part 8, A World Journey, Mystery and Magic by The Imperator AMORC, from Rosicrucian Digest, Volume 32, Number 8, August 1954. The Thought of the Month, Mystery and Magic by The Imperator AMORC. This article is the 8th of a series being written by the Imperator after his return from a world journey in behalf of the Rosicrucian Order. Editor. We had left behind us Pretoria, with its parliament buildings, tree-lined streets, and quiet orderliness. The terrain had changed. We were now at a lower and warmer altitude. The countryside was picturesque in its rolling contour. The soil, generally, here in Transvaal, is a bright red. When photographically reproduced, it seems artificial, as if an error had been made in the color rendition. This red contrasted strikingly and pleasantly with the intense green of the foliage, because of a reverse of season from which the northern hemisphere we were experiencing spring-like weather. Fortunately, we were spared the heavy rains of the summer, the month of January being the middle of the South African summer and the month when the heaviest rainfall might be expected, as in sections of America and elsewhere in the world. The paucity of rain plagues the farmers and growers of the Transvaal. Irrigation programs are underway, but in proportion to the general need, they are still scattered projects. Through the courtesy of the Department of Native Affairs, one of whose representatives accompanied our safari part of the way, we had the opportunity of inspecting some of the irrigation undertakings. A serious attempt is being made by this department to teach the natives the need of conserving water and the danger of soil erosion. Part of this instruction is in the building of dams. The district commissioners of these native areas are delighted in pointing out the several small dams being built by the native labor under their direction. They showed with pride how otherwise arid land had been reclaimed and was being cultivated by the natives as a result of this irrigation. One instance was particularly amusing and constituted an insight into the psychological problems that confronts the Department of Native Affairs. We were walking between the rows of bright green bean plants alongside in a shallow ditch. There moved sluggishly and gurgled the muddy water from a nearby dam. The setting was idyllic. A warm sun shone down from an azure cloudless sky. The air was heavily perfumed with the fragrance of spring flowers and from rows of vegetable plants. This plot of land was assigned to a small family of Basutus. It is incumbent upon them to keep the ditches free from obstacles and to cultivate the crops. In consideration of this, they can have all they require for food and, as I understand, might sell the balance and retain most or all of the proceeds. It is a serious attempt to convert a nomadic and pastoral people to an agrarian life. We approached the district commissioner, who had preceded us across the cultivated field. He was remonstrating with a Basutu woman of huge proportions. She was as wide in girth as was tall in height. She changed from speaking in her dialect to English as we came up, so as to justify, by explanation, the firmness of her tone and manner. He was vigorously attempting to make her understand how she had neglected to spend the necessary time to keep the plants of her plot of land free of weeds. He was pointing out where the irrigation ditches had become clogged and flooded a section of the land due to her neglect, in a kindly but firm manner. Like an exasperated parent, he was shaking his finger at her. Her only reaction to all this was to give vent to perils of mirth that convulsed her huge torso in rhythmic quivering. She was actually enjoying the frustration of the district commissioner and the attention her dereliction had provided. He then explained the lack of importance that many of the natives placed upon the educational program that the administration was introducing, something the Department of Native Affairs is now learning, or perhaps will learn, is that a psychological adjustment to life's new values and ends is not accomplished in a people in a relatively short time. One's view of the future is often determined by his ambition or personal idealism. If immediate satisfaction and sensual pleasure, or at least freedom from physical and mental aggravation, constitutes one's concept of the end in life, then laborious programs for some future objective are hard to promote. Many of these natives are content when today they have food. Why spoil the satisfaction of the day by laboring for tomorrow when the immediate needs have been fulfilled? When tomorrow arrives, it will meet in turn. Unlike the white men, these natives, as most primitive peoples, do not live in consciousness beyond the moment. From the psychological point of view, consciousness is now. So life to them is but a series of present moments. All the concern about a future that has not yet arrived looks to them like an amusing fault of character of the white man. He labors now for a time that has not arrived. How much better, from their point of view, to enjoy the now when it is possible, meet the tomorrow when it arrives with whatever it demands of you at that time. The bush country. It was dusk when we had arrived. It had been several days since we left the little farms of the natives. For hours this day we had traveled through the bush country. It was aptly named. For miles about, a tableland is seen, occasionally farmed by a stark, low-laying range of mountains, trees, shrubbery, and height, seemingly parched in the dry late winter or early spring, are a monotone gray, few being of the evergreen variety. Thickly scattered between the trees are various types of shrubs, averaging a height of 8 feet. As we stopped, the dust swirled about the car in our safari caravan. This was the Singwitsi district. It was the outpost of a supervisor of the Department of Native Affairs, Mr. R. Hewitt Ivy. Here in the midst of the bush, on the frontier of the greatest game preserve in the world, he lives in a comparatively comfortable, though dangerous, surroundings. His home from the outside was not like a simple farm dwelling, such as might be seen in Canada, Australia, or the United States. A few fruit trees were scattered about. Mr. Ivory himself typifies the cinema portrayal of the white hunter. He is jolly and loquacious, as men often are who live in isolated places in the world and have but few visitors. He was of medium height and stockily built, and perhaps in his middle 50s. His physique, as a whole, might be termed rugged. He had known of our coming, and though we were strangers, his welcome was like that of most frontier men, as if we were old friends. His shirt open at the neck, and his soiled trousers, with generous creases, had that casual appeal that invites informality. His voice was deep and his guffaw contagious. It prompted a joyous response to his remarks. We had just stepped from the heavily screened sleeping porch, where his provisions had been made for us to stay, to the interior of Mr. Ivory's home. Here was an atmosphere that would thrill and make enthusiastic any Hollywood producer. In fact, one has been considering a film revolving about Mr. Ivy's life. The floors were random plank, where they could be seen, for over them were scattered the huge skins of lions and other wild game. The walls were lined with the trappings of the hunt. Huge elephant tusk, worth a small fortune in ivory, were draped between assegais and other weapons and implements of the local tribes. Corners of the large room, in the center of which was a refectory-like table, were cluttered with native drums, ceremonial implements, and magical apparatuses. Photographs, aged by time, showed Mr. Ivory as a leader of expeditions and safaris into the surrounding hinterland. During dinner we were served by barefoot, grinning male natives, the personal servants of Mr. Ivy. They lived on the premises and raised for him the fresh vegetables and fruits he served us. Ivy himself took pride in his culinary art, having prepared the meal. The relationship between him and his boys was one of mutual affection. He boasted in their presence of their various abilities. They, in turn, revealed their glowing esteem for him. As we cleaned our camera equipment during the day, preparatory for the next day's events, Mr. Ivy regaled us with accounts of his experiences during many years in the bush and in contact with big game. He related that recently a Transvaal lioness had killed 5 natives in 2 days, but ate only one of the 5, a baby. He had, but the day before, killed not more than 100 yards from this dwelling 2 lions that had attacked one of his boys. He further remarked, "The lion is a gentleman in many ways, and even in a charge will sometimes give one a sporting chance by pulling up when he sees you are not out to hurt him. I do not say that this is general," he continued, "but it happened to me. A man-killer is usually an emaciated lion, one in such poor condition that he cannot overtake wild game, and thus he becomes a man-killer." Primitive society. Witchcraft is a practice frowned upon by the South African authorities, and yet it cannot be successfully suppressed, for it dates back to the dawn of human society. In every society, no matter how primitive, there are members who are thought to possess faculties and arts for invoking supernatural power. These men, individually or as a class, such as priests, are accepted as intermediaries between man and his gods, or the impersonal forces of nature. The manner in which such persons are designated as medicine men, as shaman, or witch doctors is varied. Principally, their acceptance is because of one of the 2 following causes. Either they inherit the authority and secret rites from a predecessor, or some affliction or disability leads distinction to them in the eyes of their fellows. Often an epileptic is chosen as the witch doctor in some primitive cultures because of his gyration during a seizure and the strange noises he utters at the time. These things set him off from his fellows. The shrewd individual takes advantage of this superstition to enhance the mystery that is attached to him. In some primitive societies, magic is a profession which rivals in authorities that of the chief. Some individuals have an inquiring mind and guard well those secrets of nature their predecessors have passed on to them, adding to them the results of their own personal observations. They, of course, exploit the credulity of their tribesmen. They often have an excellent knowledge of the medical and drug properties of plants. They also have a deep insight into human relations and human reactions under various conditions. They, in a sense, thus constitute practical psychologists. They know the fears, hopes, and beliefs of their people and how best to utilize them. They have discovered many fundamental laws of nature by means of which they perform feats mystifying to the other tribesmen. In justice to many of these, mganga, as they are called in the Swahili dialect, they strive to further the welfare of their people. At times they issue edicts which they imply came from a supernatural intelligence, and by means of which they direct their people to conform to certain practical requirements. Actually, the decision is one made by the witch doctor for what he, with his often superior intelligence, knows to be best for his fellows. He realizes that his people would resent an arbitrary order as issuing from him, but will abide by what they presume to be a higher authority. Thus, these witch doctors are not unlike some of the ancient messiahs who proclaimed hygienic laws in the name of the divine. The civil authorities have tried to discourage witchcraft. First, because in the majority of instances it encourages savage and barbarous customs in which human lives may be sacrificed, and second, because the activities of witch doctors often counter the influence and the laws of white man. The witch doctor. In this village just before us, there was a mganga. The kraal or village was situated on high ground. It was but a clearing in a tangle of bush and wind-blown trees. The small community numbered 4 bandas, that is, circular huts with thatched roofs. At our approach, members of the representative families poured out of the bandas. From infants to aged persons, the warm sun shone upon their perspiring and glistening bodies. They were both shy and curious as to our sudden descent upon them. Our native interpreter spoke in their dialect to one who functioned as their spokesman. He knew these natives and stated that they were prepared to give them gifts if we were permitted to witness and photograph their witch doctor while performing some of his traditional rites. The matter being finally agreed upon, and after a general shaking of hands, we were introduced to the mganga. He was tall and lithe, and perhaps in his early 30s. He, too, was shy at the presence of so many white visitors. He was obviously reluctant to perform his secret, and, as we know, forbidden rites before us. However, with further persuasion, he consented. The mganga then retired into one of the bandas to emerge shortly in the traditional regalia of his office. At his appearance, the other natives, who sat nearby, gave a low, awesome cry. He then sat cross-legged, facing a tan skin which was stretched in the dust before him. In his cupped hands, he held a collection of small ivory pieces and fragments of animal bones. Many of a mganga has been known to use the bones of humans who have been sacrificed for the purpose. In the vernacular of the white man, he was to throw the bones. This consisted of tossing these objects upon the hide stretched before him. One of these objects, in the dialect of the natives, is called the talker. The position that this latter object assumes when falling in relation to the bones and ivory pieces is thought to have special significance. The witch doctor interprets the position in accordance with his presumed exalted insight. In diagnosing a disease, the talker's position indicates the malady and the type of remedial measure which must be pursued. Actually, the interpretation is merely the personal opinion and experience of the witch doctor. Undoubtedly, he does have at times a subconscious or psychic impression about the malady from being in close contact with the patient. This impression then enters into the diagnosis. The ritual of throwing the bones is merely an impressive ceremony to objectify the intuitive impression, or what at times is but the showed guest of the mganga. To test the procedure, I asked our native interpreter to have him tell something about me. The members of the kraal seated nearby were listening intently as the gods spoke in their tongue to the witch doctor. The qualifications and powers of their medicine man were being tested. It was critical for him as well. If he failed, his prestige would suffer. His influence would be greatly diminished. He had heard me talking to my associates, and he studied me critically all the while. Then he began a chanting, the principal word of which sounded phonetically like avuva. The tribal members, men, women, and children, responded avuva, avuva, avuva. The tempo increased. It had a tremendous psychological impact upon the emotions. The chanting grew louder and louder. Their bodies swayed in rhyme with it. Every fiber of one's being seemed to pulsate in response to the vibrations of the intonation. One could feel it in the region of the solar plexus, as well as hear it. Literally translated, we were informed that avuva meant you must do it. The powers and forces which the witch doctor was thought to have under his control were being commanded to prove themselves through his mediumship. In other words, they were to answer the challenge which we had offered. At the peak of the frenzy, he suddenly threw the bones into a jerky movement. They rolled and bounced over the rough tan skin. The chanting abruptly ended. All eyes were focused on the talker, an odd small black object. It lay at one end of the heterogeneous roll of ivory and bone fragments just where they had fallen. The eyes then focused on the mganga's face. Everyone waited breathlessly for his words. Looking down at the bones before him, he spake as though the words were issuing from afar and were merely being transmitted by him. The god then interpreted for me. He said, The mganga says that you are not of this island. Your people are far away across the great water. You will return to your people soon. We were now the center of attention. Would we confirm that we had said and thereby acknowledge the powers of the witch doctor, or would we deny his conclusion? He was, of course, correct. We were from overseas. We were not of this island, nor were we directly of English descent. We informed the interpreter that the mganga was right in his statement. We heightened the dramatic effect by appearing very surprised at the accuracy of his powers. When the interpreter conveyed our remarks, the tribesmen all uttered low exclamations of awe at the uncanny powers of the witch doctor. He had again vindicated himself. He had proven his worthiness to them. Actually, the mganga had but shown that he was actually a keen observer of human nature and of circumstances. He had heard our talking to the phratres who had accompanied us and who were South Africans. Obviously, we had an American accent quite unlike those other phratres. It was probably different from any other accent the mganga had ever heard. It was a logical conclusion that I and my associates were not of the people of South Africa. We were from afar, from some other white man's land across the sea. That we had cameras and an interpreter taking us back into the bush would imply that we were on safari, that we were not to be permanent, and relatively soon we would return to our homeland. It is this application of native intelligence which makes these witch doctors leaders of their people, for they exercise a tremendous influence over them by just such displays as this. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Rosies. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.